Before we leave this section, I have to discuss someone that comes up incredibly often in France's conversations, Chael Sonnen. I have wanted so badly to cut this section from the video, but over and over and over I am inundated with wildly inaccurate facts surrounding the situation, and I am forced to address it. Anytime I comment with facts about the situation, someone sends me a completely false statement, seemingly attempting to detract from my point. Inevitably, they lead back to something Chael said. I have watched every video Chael has put out on Francis, and I hate to break it to those that are taking his points as fact, but you are getting worked. To understand, I have to explain some professional wrestling terms. A work in professional wrestling is a choice made to deceive or manipulate an audience in order to elicit a desired response. Chael is playing a character meant to entertain you. If you take what he says as factual, then you are what is referred to in wrestling as a mark. A mark in this context is a wrestling fan who enthusiastically believes or behaves as though they believe professional wrestling is not staged, or loses sight of the staged nature of the business while supporting their favorite wrestlers. The term is often used pejoratively, for example, to refer to people who have little or no knowledge about the industry as a whole. However, it is also used by some in the business to refer to all wrestling fans. Chael is incredibly good at this, and has been doing this for years. It's why he was so great on the mic promoting himself. I say this not to offend you all that take his words as facts, but my recommendation is do a little research before you quote him. I find him wildly entertaining, but if you take his word as fact, you are a mark. But finally, we must answer what happened in those 6 days that led to these radical, redirecting choices by the UFC. I can't tell you how many theories I burned through trying to get a logical answer to the question. All my analysis after this moment is built upon disproving theory after theory, but steadily gaining a deeper understanding of what is happening to the UFC right now that Francis started. Everything clicked with this one podcast by the aforementioned John S. Nash.
We can move it into the financials. So the
there you go.
might not be looking good, but they're guaranteed a lot of revenue. Well, first off, here's one other thing before we move fully into the financials. What do you guys think about, and John, you made a little bit of mention of this, and something I've been thinking about for a while. It's ESPN they had to recognize that this affects the UFC's incentive to pay a lot for big fighters to come on pay-per-views, right? I mean, there's got to be some sort of way that they attempted, whether it'll work or not, we'll see, to address this incentive problem. You call it quality control, and you thought maybe they guaranteed them all their titles. I think that perhaps there's possibly some sort of extra payment they have on really big shows, either to cover like a Conor McGregor's type pay-per-view points, or a guaranteed purse or something like that. But there's got to be some way that they are still at least trying to keep the UFC motivated to sign big fighters. Could be wrong, but what do you guys thoughts on that?
Well, I guess my thoughts, because Jason doesn't seem like he's quick to jump in on that one. So my thoughts on that is there's a bonus, I think, when the UFC crosses a certain level. So there's an incentive to do big numbers because they start getting a split again. They start making more money. So I think that's one incentive. But I do think the one big incentive, because the UFC is very much they don't like giving up control. So I think they want to keep control of the matchmaking, keep that sort of control. And the reason they've gone all out to put up title fights and all the pay-per-view is I think that was their stake they were putting out there, that the pay-per-views are going to be the exclusive home of title fights. That's the selling point. Go to ESPN and say, we guarantee every pay-per-view will have a title fight. Only title fights will be on pay-per-view. ESPN might say, well, that doesn't guarantee who's going to fight. They go, yeah, but the major stars are champions. They're only going to be on pay-per-view. They have nowhere else to go.
I believe that this is what happened. I agree with John's opinion. I believe that the UFC is likely contractually obligated to put all its title fights on pay-per-view, meaning that the inverse is true. All pay-per-views have to either have a huge fight or a title on the line. Like, say, Nate Diaz versus Masvidal for a made-up title. Remember again back to that Francis interview where he asked to fight in July or August and the UFC said they were full? July was UFC 264 between Conor and Dustin Poirier. Huge fight leading to an asterisk, because ESPN undoubtedly signed off on exempting it from the rule. August was UFC 265, originally slated to be headlined by Nunes vs. Pena for the bantamweight title. Check. But imagine, you are the UFC. You need to make sure that you have a suitable backup ready, right? I suspect that the UFC had a number of options, but to me the most logical choice was Valentina Shevchenko defending her flyweight title in the co-main. I went through every title holder at the time, and Shevchenko makes absolutely the most sense. She fought at UFC 266 and wasn't yet scheduled in June, so they had to have been in negotiations. It would set up a super fight between Shevchenko and Nunes if both successfully defended, or if either Pena or Nunes fell off the card, they could have made it an interim fight between Valentina and the remaining fighter. A promotional goldmine, right? I suspect that they were in talks with Valentina and most likely Lauren Murphy, who she eventually fought 1 month later, in order to co-main UFC 265. I suspect that sometime Saturday night into Sunday, one of the fighters, most likely Valentina, told the UFC they wouldn't be ready to compete at 265, and the UFC panicked. With Cyril having just won and still being in America, I suspect they called him up and asked if he could be ready for 265 to fight Lewis for an interim title. Key to this point, the UFC wasn't trying to discredit Francis's title with his interim, but rather they made it out of desperation so they could fulfill the contract Endeavor had negotiated with ESPN. That contract likely motivated the matchmaking. Francis and others consistently said that they would have been fine with the fight occurring, it was just the interim title that bothered them. Does Francis being ready a month after the date they wanted really seem like a reasonable concern that motivated the UFC to create an interim title? Not to me. But what if they were fearful of not living up to their contractual obligations, of which they were proven right when Nunes fell off due to COVID? Under my hypothetical, the UFC's choice makes a lot more sense. But therein lies my critique. Irrespective of if I am right or not, the true problem with those 6 days was communication. The UFC did not communicate with Francis that these decisions were being made without him, thus making him feel as though they are his adversaries rather than all in the same boat. I will leave you to debate if that is reasonable on Francis's part. I personally think it is, but opinions aside, this was what created the initial fracture in the relationship. Had Dana or others come to Francis and explained the situation, I expect he would have reacted rationally and no longer been as adversarial as he became. Instead, the Endeavor-led UFC buried him in their promotion of UFC 265 out of spite and questionable business decision-making, and then continued to bury him until the point that Francis essentially gave up on negotiations. With all the information and hypotheticals laid out, ask yourself if the UFC reacted rationally to either fighter's complaints. In the end, though, things worked out with Jones, and they had worked out in the past with Francis, so my critiques of their actions ultimately don't explain everything. That is because the real person at fault is one man in my opinion. Chief Business Officer of the UFC and likely heir to Dana's throne at the head of the UFC, Hunter Campbell. So who is Hunter Campbell? Campbell is a lawyer that was brought in by Endeavor when they first bought a majority stake in the UFC back in 2016. He is the clear number 2 to Dana in terms of decision making within the company and is clearly being set up to run the promotion once Dana retires. More important than that though is this concept. Ari Emanuel, the CEO of Endeavor, is a notoriously hands-on businessman. He is well known for being highly involved in every minor decision-making process within Endeavor. Over time, he seems to have realized that that image was hurting his ability to work with certain people, so he changed up his approach. By all accounts, Ari is incredibly hands-off in the day-to-day of the UFC's management. Does it make any sense that a notorious micromanager is hands-off with 50% of his firm's monetary value? Not to me. What does make more sense is that Ari is publicly positive while using Hunter as a Trojan horse to enact change after change that asserts more and more top-down control by Endeavor while steadily pushing Dana to the side. Dana even seems to telegraph this in the way that he slightly degrades Hunter by calling him his lawyer instead of chief business officer and clear vice president to Dana's president. Hunter is Endeavor's influence personified. Let's look at some examples that I think really point to this conclusion. There is no greater example of Endeavor's persistent top-down centralization of decision-making than the newly revised standard UFC contract. Let's talk about that now. The first major change added to the new contract is a provision specifically relating to the legal remedies fighters are able to consider against the UFC. Quoting Anton Dubuena, who did a write-up of John S. Nash's research, If fighters have any disagreements with the UFC over anything in their promotional agreements, instead of taking them to court, they are now required to have the dispute arbitrated. If you are like me, not a lawyer, this is an interpretation of what that means for fighters. On the surface, this doesn't seem like that big of a change. To begin with, very, very few fighters have ever sued the UFC. Adding arbitration would not take away a fighter's right to dispute something in the agreement. It would, however, likely tilt the playing field even more heavily into the UFC's favor. Arbitration significantly protects the UFC better than actual legal proceedings. Arbitration, unlike the lawsuits in the courts, are private. There is no public record detailing what is being disputed or any disclosure of filings or exhibits. Fighters and media will all be kept in the dark about the developments, which only helps the UFC's cause, especially in the long run. As the quote says, that makes it harder for people like me to make videos like this to inform the average fan of the actuality of the labor situation in the UFC. The second major change is another legal jargon rewrite with respect to fighters' ability to form a class in a class action lawsuit. A fighter that signs this agreement will not be allowed to be a class member in any class action lawsuit, including the current Johnson v. Zuffa lawsuit, even if the court certifies the class and the fighter meets all the criteria to be classified as a member. If damages are awarded by a jury or settlement, plaintiffs are asking for hundreds of millions of dollars in damages, potentially billions if trebled. Fighters who sign this agreement will not be eligible for them. We are 2 major changes into this new contract, and already fighters have signed away 2 of their main avenues to dispute legal mistreatment by the Endeavor-led UFC. Instead, if fighters shared the same dispute as found in a class action lawsuit, they would have to go to arbitration to have their individual dispute heard separately. They would also have foot the bill themselves, even if they are making the same case that the class action attorneys and experts who are working on contingent may have already made. The price of hiring such experts for something like an antitrust case would likely be prohibitive for all but a few fighters. Do you remember the tolling provisions from before? That was when the UFC was sending Francis contract extensions because of his rejection of fights. They're back and better than ever. Quoting Anton and John again, one of the complaints in both antitrust lawsuits is the use of tolling provisions by the UFC to extend their contracts. If the promotion offers a fighter a bout and they are unable or unwilling to take it, the UFC has the ability to extend the agreement an additional 6 months or the amount of time required to find another opponent. Before 2017, there was no limit to the number of extensions the UFC can add this way. Contracts could therefore be in perpetuity if the fighter decided he was no longer willing to compete for the promotion. In 2017, the UFC changed this provision so that the maximum amount of time the UFC could extend a contract for a fighter that was unable or unwilling to compete was only 18 months. In the most recent contracts Bloody Elbow has obtained, this 18-month extension limit has been removed. The UFC has also added multiple reasons as for why opponents might not be available. Due to the return of this controversial clause, now the only limit to how long a contract could be extended is the 5-year sunset provision. So finally, let's get back to the sunset provision / clause, the entire reason that Francis was able to do what he did. Quoting Anton and John again, contracts Bloody Elbow have obtained now show that the sunset period starts after the fighter's first bout, instead of the clock starting the day the deal was signed. They've also added a clause stating that suspensions no longer count on this duration. Compared to the previous setup, this new language could easily mean that the 5-year period essentially ends up months or years longer, especially if Athletic Commission medical suspensions are included. Simply, Endeavor's rewrite is substantially reducing the potency of the sunset clause as a means of giving fighters leverage to truly explore free agency. So, let's hear from Anton and John about what this means in overall impact. How exactly would the UFC, a company being sued for abusing its market power by forcing one-sided contract terms, be allowed to now force contract terms that prevent them from being sued for abusing their market power? Well, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld that this was legal in Epic Systems Corp. v. Lewis back in 2018 in a 5-4 ruling. This makes it unlikely that these new additions to UFC contracts can be challenged without new legislation. I think the following story that they included does a fantastic job of summarizing. As former 2-division champ Randy Couture noted on his attempt to take on the UFC and restrictive contracts during his career, the upside to that is I got a much better deal moving forward. The downside is they closed a bunch of the loopholes in those crappy contracts and made it more difficult for other fighters moving forward. So what does reading between the lines tell us? I believe the UFC may have been attempting to liberalize its talent market. Not politically liberal, but economically, i.e. make markets freer. The sport was on a path to maturation like the NBA, NFL, and other major market sports, as they too were spurred on by the threat of antitrust litigation. But Endeavor realized that the liberalization of the contract directly hurt their bottom line. Over time, they rewrote the contract to be even more strict than the contract used prior to Francis's final one. Why? Because in the end, everything goes back to paying off their debt obligations they incurred purchasing the UFC. Endeavor is more than likely going to spend whatever it has to in both political capital as well as hard dollars to fight the antitrust lawsuit and maintain their monopsony of MMA. The reason I didn't release a video in the immediate aftermath of Francis becoming a free agent was so that I could study how Endeavor and Hunter would telegraph their reaction to the whole situation. A couple weeks ago, it all clicked for me. After reading John's article about the new contract, I kept my eyes open for Endeavor's rollout strategy. Unsurprisingly, it was incredibly telegraphed and ham-fisted, as Endeavor has proven time and time again is their MO. What Endeavor is forcing the UFC to do is rapidly extend the contracts of fighters currently under the old contract Francis was under. When fighters extend or re-sign deals, it overrides all those legal protections that Francis used to leverage himself into a better negotiating position. Here are a number of examples of fighters that I have seen accept the new contract. Why do I think this is a strategy rather than happenstance? Because the UFC almost universally offers contract extensions at the same time as their second-to-last bout offer, because it's when their leverage is at its peak. Signing fighters with fights already signed or outside of that specific fight offer shows the immediacy with which they are trying to quote-unquote fix their problem. I want to be clear, these fighters I am showing are not to be blamed. Their managers are. Any manager should be seeing the massive rewrites of these contracts and fighting tooth and nail for their clients. But as I have laid out in past videos, most major managers are basically in-house representatives assigned by the UFC, in my opinion, or to be more generous, are just merely incompetent and don't actually know this is happening. These fighters represent what I have been calling the middle class of MMA within the UFC. For the middle class, it is extensions with a minor raise. For those that want to comment, but isn't that good? Fighter pay is going up, but understand that this new contract is nearly equivalent to the Adidas deal in terms of how much more restrictive it is in signing away fighters' rights. Maybe worst of all for us the fans is what I see happening for upper class fighters, the cream of the crop. These fighters won't accept a simple raise. They are likely forcing championship fights. Maybe you're wondering why Henry Cejudo came out of retirement right into a title fight. He was under the old Francis contract. Do you think he would accept a minor raise to extend? Or do you think he would leverage that situation into a title shot? Now what about Colby Covington? All that weird matchmaking starts to make more sense now, doesn't it? The UFC offers a surprise title shot. All you have to do is sign away every one of your contractual rights to get it. Going forward, I expect more fighters that are recently retired to be offered either big money fights or title shots to coerce them to sign over to the new contract. But something hit me when listening to a couple interviews that caused me to delay this video. I listened to a number of major promoters describing their negotiations with Francis. Francis is currently managing himself, and I suspect he has a simple list of necessities in order to consider signing with a promotion. Based on my research, I believe he is asking for the following. 1. The promotion must match the purse the UFC offered. 2. The promotion must offer a seat on its board to a fighter representative to give fighters more of a seat at the monetary table. And 3. Francis wants the freedom to promote himself as a boxer without the promotion limiting his options. Nothing about this is unsurprising. What is surprising is what they say and what it says about the MMA promotional environment as a whole. Let's go promotion by promotion to contextualize my eureka moment. Bellator, and specifically Scott Coker, were the first to speak on negotiating with Francis all the way back in late January/early February. Let's see what Scott had to say.
I asked you about the heavyweight title, and if he wins, Fyodor that is, the belt becomes vacant. Since we last spoke, Scott, you may have heard the news that the UFC heavyweight champion is now a free agent. What a scenario that would be, right? He walks in, and in my opinion, he's still the champ, and goes for your belt. Any interest at all? Any talks at all? Anything at all with the great Francis Ngannou?
Yeah, I think that of course there's interest. Anytime there's a free agent at this level, we were talking to everybody all the time, and Francis is somebody that we would have high interest in. And I know there's dialogue going on, and I look forward to a sit down in the very near future.
Oh, wow.
Then, largely silence until
When it comes to saying yes, I mean, you've talked about having conversations with pretty much any free agent who's out there. I mean, do you have any updates on any of that stuff? Particularly like Francis. I mean, if you had a conversation with Francis, is there a point where he'd be too expensive? Like, would he say a number and you'd go, well, we're not going to do that, so we're just going to move on?
Listen, my guys have been talking to Francis. I know they met. I know Steven met with him on the boxing side. I've always said that I think would be a perfect fit for him because he could do boxing, he could do MMA. But I don't think that there's anything close to a deal being presented back and forth. So I mean, let's see what happens. Anything can happen, but I'm not sure that we're going to be in that business on the MMA side. Maybe for the boxing side, it might work out. But to me, it's like it has to be equitable for everybody, and that's how I feel. And there's we have a pretty robust purse amount every year, and we can spread that around. We can take a lot of that purse and pay our guys and sign other fighters and keep building divisions, right? So to me, it's like, I would say it's 50-50 at this point.
all good, right? Or maybe not. You see, the announcement of the beginning of their negotiations occurred in the promotional lead-up to Bellator's grand return to free CBS programming with Fedor's retirement fight versus Ryan Bader. Huh. Then, Scott publicly announces the MMA side is out the week leading up to the next major event beginning the lightweight Grand Prix tournament in an event headlined by the retiring Benson Henderson versus Usman Nurmagomedov. Interesting. And what about the other major MMA promotion that expressed public interest? ONE FC and promoter Chatri may be the most fascinating of the bunch to me. Chatri sat down for an in-studio interview with Ariel Helwani and was asked about ONE's interest in Francis. Here is what he has to say.
Where do we stand with Francis Ngannou?
So Francis, we've been in discussions. I like Francis. I think he brings a lot to the table. I think that I think he'll have a tough time in our heavyweight division, to be very frank, which I've said publicly, and I think it's a big challenge for Francis. When you look at a guy like Anatoly Malikin, he's 12-0, was a former Russian national team wrestler, one-punch KO power. He's 12-0 with a 80% finish rate. That is the worst nightmare to face against a big striker like Ngannou. But at the same time, Francis has an X factor. He is a giant monster, and he has a bunch of offers on the table. He's waiting for our final offer.
Oh,
We have given him. I don't know. My team did it, but I am going to meet Francis this Saturday.
oh wow.
Yeah.
Where?
L.A.
In LA.
Yeah.
You're gonna meet, and is that when you expect to give him a final offer?
Well, he and I will sit down and talk.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, for sure, one can give him the biggest offer on the table out of all his bids, but it has to work for him. It has to work for us. Everything's got to be
Sure.
And I just believe that meeting somebody, you get the you get the energy. You get.
But did you notice what I noticed? Listen to these two clips and ask yourself what Chatri is actually doing.
He brings a lot to the table. I think that I think he'll have a tough time in our heavyweight division, to be very frank, which I've said publicly, and I think it's a big challenge for Francis. When you look at a guy like Anatoly Malikin, he's 12-0, was a former Russian national team wrestler, one-punch KO power. He's 12-0 with a 80% finish rate. That is the worst nightmare to face against a big striker like Ngannou. I do believe he's a big pay-per-view draw in boxing or in MMA. Of course, it has to be the right opponent, right? I think that Francis will run through the heavyweight division of all the other organizations. The only heavyweight division that will give him a challenge, even think of, let's say, a rising star like Buchecha. I think he's 5-0 or 6-0 in one. He is arguably the greatest grappler of all time. Right? He's a 13-time, 14-time Jiu-Jitsu world champion. He's run through all the opponents. That kind of style, and he's incredible wrestling. That kind of style is a nightmare for Francis, right? And that's just a rising star within the heavyweight division.
Chatri spends more time discussing how much better his roster already is than Francis, while barely actually talking about how his promotion can benefit Francis. Days later, Chatri, in an interview with the South China Times, publicly ended their negotiation with Francis 2 days after they reportedly met. That also happens to be the Monday before their first ever and massive U.S. event headlined by the trilogy bout between Demetrius Johnson versus Adriano Moraes. Do you see my point? Chatri is using Francis for PR, just as Bellator and Coker were, right? Another small, non-MMA example. Bare Knuckle publicly announced their interest in signing Francis and then publicly ended the negotiations. During the pre-fight press conference for the biggest pay-per-view event in their history, headlined by Luke Rockhold versus Mike Perry. To bring Chael back into this, he had some sort of co-promotional deal with BKFC, and it's obvious from his Francis video release schedule that they were set to coincide with promotionally relevant moments for BKFC. In English, he is just using Francis to promote BKFC as well. Back to Chatri. This is what he had to say on the negotiation. At the end of the day, I didn't feel Francis and I were fully aligned on non-financial matters, Sichadong added. It is nothing personal, it is just a lack of alignment. Now, 3 of the 4 major promotions were willing to meet Francis financially, in direct opposition to what every quote-unquote media member with a microphone has to say about the situation. The sticking point is the non-financial matters. Take a moment and consider what that means. For starters, any argument that Francis is financially pricing himself out of the market is ludicrous. The only promotion that has said this is Bare Knuckle. They have a fraction of the finances of one, UFC, or Bellator, so they don't actually count. For any of these promotions, meeting the specific individual demands of Francis that I outlined earlier from his free agency interview with Ariel are not at all legitimate deal breakers in a negotiation. I explained why they were deal breakers for Endeavor, but the other promotions don't have the financial concerns Endeavor does, right? Any of these promotions could offer Francis his terms purely as a means of sticking it to the UFC with minor amounts of financial expense in the grand scheme of things for them. So why didn't they do it? Therein lies the key to what I believe Francis is trying to show the MMA audience. Francis has struck genuine fear in each of these promotions because of the non-financial matters. Francis wants to set a precedent that can be used by others to negotiate for better fighter rights. This is why everyone defaults to a money argument. The billionaire owners of these promotions are terrified by that aspect of what Francis wants. The billionaire owners want you to think he is pricing himself out so that you, the audience, are distracted by the red herring. They essentially see you as sheep. Very few major media members are actually seeing this for what it is. Those promotions fear setting the precedent more than they want to stick it to the UFC. Why? Because the economics of MMA are broken. The only way they can continue to extract massive amounts of money from MMA is to keep the contracts incredibly restrictive. And that goes for every promotion. The UFC built its empire on restrictive contracts to beat their competition, then attempted to open their markets to completely decimate their competition. But financial pressure from Endeavor ended that. The actions of the other promotions show one incontrovertible fact. They are not competitors of the UFC. In Egypt, there is a species of bird known as the Egyptian plover. You may have heard of them because of one particular trait they have. Egyptian plovers are famous for their symbiotic relationship with crocodiles. When crocodiles eat, they invariably get food stuck in their teeth. The plover reaches its head into the crocodile's mouth and eats the leftovers from between their teeth in order to relieve the pain it causes the crocodile, while the plover gets a meal. The plover sits on a difficult balancing act, right? If it angers the crocodile, the next plover is picking the first from the crocodile's teeth. These quote-unquote competitors are the plover to the billionaire owner's crocodile. If they step too far out of line, the metaphorical jaw clamps shut, and that's the end of them. I often get asked, who is legitimate competition for the UFC? And invariably my answer is no one. And this is an incredible example of why. Quote-unquote competitor promotions like Bellator and ONE will never amount to anything because they refuse to actively compete. These promotions are terrified of the actual decision makers, the billionaire owners of their promotions. UFC with Endeavor, Bellator with media giant Viacom, and ONE FC with 2 Singapore sovereign wealth-funded megacorporations, GIC and Temasek Holdings. These 2 firms have over $1 trillion in combined assets under management, putting both Viacom and Endeavor to shame in pure scale. These people care only for the bottom line. All fighters, fights, and fans like us are to them but a number on a piece of paper that buys them their next super yacht. Personally, I prefer to side with those showing the integrity to make a difference for those around them. I'm going to drop the veil of objectivity to give you my opinion on Francis now. I think that the MMA media landscape and the fandom broadly has completely missed what is happening. I absolutely consider myself in that group until I buckled in and worked a ton on this video. I take a while to put videos out because the key to understanding what is really happening is time. I need to spend time researching, reading news, and steadily changing my mental model of what is occurring. MMA media has unfortunately largely gone in the direction of volume shitposting, which inundates you, the fan, with so much information that it's impossible to keep up. This benefits those owners who view these situations in decades rather than months. Most fans can't even remember Dana's trash talking of John from interviews literally under 2 years ago. Francis has been a free agent for a bit over 4 months at the time of release, yet the most common response to me speaking positively on him is that he has, quote-unquote, failed. How do you know? It's been 4 months. I saw a fantastic tweet that really crystallized how I want to end this video. For those that fit into the criticism Alvarado is making, ask yourself why you care. Why are you rooting against him? If Francis had continued working in sand mines and tried to improve working conditions for his fellow worker, would you be so hard on him and laugh every time one of these corrupt managers makes blatantly propagandized statements about their negotiations? If your employer broadcast the deals of your salary daily in your local paper and laughed at you asking for a raise for yourself and rights for your fellow worker, would you still feel the same? Or are you mad that you don't get to see Francis fight John Jones just as I am? I suspect you don't actually care about the pay nor the rights. What you are mad about is the fight not happening. In the end, that's not Francis's fault, it's Endeavor's. If they weren't so hell-bent on sucking every dollar from the sport we love, that fight would have happened easily. Dana has always said that boxing died because they no longer made the fights that fans wanted. Dana said that the UFC would never be that when he was in charge. Endeavor has pushed Dana aside and learned nothing from boxing's failure. They aren't learning the lesson Dana did from boxing's fall. They smear Francis to distract you from this one overriding fact. The UFC can't claim to make the biggest fights anymore. Endeavor's greed ended the negotiations for one of the biggest fights in history because their fear of losing their monopoly outweighed their interest in quality matchmaking. So, I ask one last question of you, the audience. A man from Cameroon who grew up with nothing, traveled halfway across the world and reached the pinnacle of a sport only to realize that his fellow fighter was being taken advantage of. He makes a stand against the billionaire owner class and their endless greed. They continue to offer him more and more money just to shut up and sign the contract. He realizes this and digs in his heels. He won't be bought. He endures years of propagandized slander when he could any day just accept that payoff and be rid of his issues. Yet he doesn't. What does that say about such a man? Chatri said the following about his negotiation with Francis. He was asking for a seat at the board of directors. We obviously can't give a seat at the board of directors. That doesn't make any sense. He would be a fish out of water. That's blatantly false, as we have covered. He wanted a fighter advocate on the board, not himself. So, Chatri is either purposefully obfuscating the truth or is just outright incompetent. Quote, he was asking for him to determine his opponent's pay. That is a calculated half-truth. Here's the reality. Francis was asking for a minimum salary for any fighter that faces him. Francis doesn't want his opponents to be taken advantage of while he is getting paid big money to fight. Does this sound like a greedy person to you? Does this sound unreasonable? Ask yourself this. Would I spend months researching just to make a hagiography for Francis? Or did Francis just open my eyes to just how rotten the foundation has become as corruption sinks its teeth deeper and deeper into the sport, turning it into the next boxing? This is what Francis is trying to show us. Like I said in response to Owerdo's tweet, in the short term they'll laugh. In the future, it will look obvious to all the fans that trashed Francis. If you call yourself a real fan, I think the choice of who to put our trust in is clear. If you are watching this the day of release, I am releasing a podcast this afternoon on our Patreon breaking down the incredible situation occurring right now between Conor McGregor's manager and Manny Pacquiao. I see no major MMA outlet discussing the truly massive implications and insane story this is. If you want to hear weekly updates on the changing business landscape of MMA and how it affects every aspect of the viewing experience, as well as hear my breakdowns and recaps of upcoming MMA events, check out our Patreon, which can be found in the description. I have breakdowns of Mighty Mouse vs. Moraes 3 and a full breakdown of every interesting fight on UFC 288 this week. I will be doing a Q&A there the Friday after this video is released to answer commonly asked questions in the video. I will see you all next time.